Welcome back. You know, when you filled out your application for graduate school, most of those had a question. Why do you want to be a psychotherapist? And the answer you weren't supposed to say was actually the true one, and that is, you wanted to help people. Certainly, you didn't get into the field for the money. That's never going to be in the cards. Most of us really want to help people. And here's a curious fact. Some of us are better at it than others. In fact, here's what the research says. Differences between therapists consistently account for between 5 and 9% of the variability in treatment outcomes. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, 5 to 9%, that's not very much. Well, if you were getting 5 to 9% in your retirement accounts, you would be plenty happy with that. But 5 to 9% has to be seen as a proportion of the total amount of variance that therapy contributes to outcome. What's that figure? 13%. So 5 to 9% of the 13% is actually a huge number. The point is, the most effective ingredient in psychotherapy is you. And as I said, some therapists seem to be better at it than others. This is one of the things that we began to discover when we started measuring outcomes. You'll recall that we couldn't figure out what led some therapies to be more effective than others. So we began to measure. And when we measured, we started to notice that therapists seemed to account for those differences. And those differences persisted even when researchers did things like controlling the amount of experience a therapist had, their age, their gender, the particular theoretical orientation or model that was used, their social skill level, their professional degree, whether they were a PhD, an MD, a master's level person, or a peer professional, the years of experience, even the time spent conducting therapy. When we hold all those variables constant, still, some therapists emerge as better than others. Now, I hope you were curious, like I was, wondering what could account for that difference in effect. Because the more experienced therapists, the difference isn't small, it's monumental. The best therapists achieve 50% better outcomes and suffer 50% fewer dropouts than their less effective counterparts. So, what's the difference? If it's not all those variables I mentioned, how is it that some therapists are more effective than others? I think you're going to be surprised about what does not make a difference. Studies to date show that there is little to no evidence that traditional professional training leads to better outcomes. This is likely to make you angry if you're still paying off your student loans, but that's just the nature of the beast. There's no difference either between professionals, students, and paraprofessionals or peer supports. There's very little evidence that supervision actually improves treatment outcomes. Now, I know what you might be thinking again. How could supervision not lead to better outcomes? I wondered the same thing too. And yet, that's what the data say. Even though therapists say it's the number 2 contributor in terms of importance to their development as a therapist, it just doesn't make a difference in terms of our outcomes. And as I've said, experience, being here in the field, growing gray at the temples, wearing tweed coats rather than the latest chic clothing, just doesn't make a difference in terms of outcome. And continuing education, well, you're all mandated to attend continuing education to maintain your license. There is virtually no research about that. So what does work? Well, here's what we do know. Clinicians who routinely obtain feedback on the progress and the status of the relationship with their individual clients have outcomes that are much better and dropout rates that are much less. In fact, numerous studies actually confirm this now in the research literature. That process is known as feedback-informed treatment, and it means monitoring on a routine basis at the beginning of each session and the end of each session the client's progress and the status of the relationship with them. When therapists do so, the research evidence indicates that clients stay in therapy, outcomes improve, the cost of treatment is actually reduced, and client complaints also decrease. That means clients' complaints to licensing boards, etc. Since we first began investigating feedback-informed work, back at the turn of the millennium, the research literature has not only grown, but the popularity of the approach is also increased. It's now being implemented by practitioners and agencies around the world. Thousands visit my website every week to download the measures, and agencies and governments around the world are putting funding into helping clinicians implement this in their work. Now, if you're like me, then you probably work very hard at staying in touch with your clients. You're probably asking them for feedback on a routine basis. But let's think about this from a medical perspective. If your physician asks you about your blood pressure, unless you have a cuff at home, do you really have anything of value to offer? The physician doesn't use their judgment. They actually use a measurement tool to find out whether or not the treatment that they prescribe to help you with your blood pressure is actually making a difference. This is the paradox of feedback. When they are asked, most therapists say they value feedback, that supervision is important to them, and another thing they say is that as experience lengthens in the field, the primary way that they learn how to do therapy is to listen more carefully to their clients. Interestingly though, even though therapists think they're seeking feedback, the studies suggest actually that they don't. In other words, the therapist experience of asking for feedback is quite different from the client's experience of being asked for feedback, unless there's some formal process, a ritual so to speak, where time is taken for the client to complete a form and a discussion follows. Clients just don't see the feedback in the same way that therapists do.